Hello and welcome back to another video from Hill and Valley. Today we're going to have a little bit different of a format. This video is going to be more of a discussion with Joel and I. For those of you who might not know, Joel and I handle most of the production here, so we're typically the ones using the cameras. And we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the decisions we make when we're approaching a shoot and how our decisions differ and how they're similar in different scenarios.
Depending on the different scenarios you can be in when creating a short film or shooting a commercial or any type of video production, there's lots of different options you have. You can approach things in a lot of different ways, and although Adam and I work together all the time, we come from different filmmaking backgrounds, so there's a lot of different approaches we might have to the same situation. So considering multiple options can be really helpful when you're approaching a shoot and trying to decide what's going to be best for that particular scenario.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have different approaches, and obviously that's kind of what goes into making a cinematographer's style. So we kind of want to talk a little bit about the reason behind why we make these decisions and how that contributes to our videos.
So the first topic we're going to talk about is focal length, what our favorite focal lengths are for different scenarios, or if we have a go-to focal length that we usually use to approach a shoot.
Yeah, and we actually have not done any discussion beforehand, so I'm
Yes.
interested to see what you say. I think
Yeah.
everybody knows what my answer would be, but I'll let you go first.
Okay. So I kind of have two answers. If I'm approaching a shoot and I don't know anything about it, and if I had to only pick one fixed focal length, I would pick a 35mm prime lens. To me, 35 is just wide enough to show a subject and their environment, but at least with the 35mm lens that we have, it has a pretty close focusing distance, so you can not quite get a tight shot, but you can bring the camera in close and isolate a subject with some good depth of field and everything. But I feel like it's, in my opinion, the most versatile focal length, where just moving the camera closer or further away can usually get you the variety that you need for most types of shoots.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. My go-to focal length is also a 35mm. We're going to be talking about things in terms of full frame cameras today because we pretty much exclusively shoot on full frame sensors. And I would agree with everything you said, but also I feel like most of the time, the things I see, like when I'm writing out a storyboard or a shot list, the framing is of a 35mm lens. I know that's popular for a lot of people with 35 or 50, depending on kind of the way you see things. But I just really enjoy the field of view of a 35mm lens, and I really like how you could easily get a nice wide. I feel like that's what most people think of are like wides and mediums with a 35. But I really like the look of getting closer to a subject with a 35 and the separation it creates. It's just tight enough where it's not going to create too much distortion, but it can kind of give you a little bit more of a heroic look when you get closer to things because of that separation and the little bit of, I guess, distortion that comes with a 35mm lens.
Yeah, and to go off of that, my second answer for this is depending on the scenario. For example, setting up an interview and just getting a static shot of someone sitting, either talking to camera or just off camera. I think an 85mm is my second favorite because I really like that it doesn't have much distortion or almost any distortion on people's faces. And I like the level of background distortion it gives you, where you can still slightly see what the background is, whereas sometimes if you're using like a 200mm, the background just gets so blurred out that sometimes you can't even really tell what's there.
Yeah, it starts to melt away.
Yeah, so I think depending on the situation, an 85 can be really nice for that and isolating someone, but at the same time with a 35, depending on what you're going for, if you get close with a 35, the background is blurry, but you can still make out the shape, so it kind of keeps your subject in a real environment, even though the subject is definitely the focal point.
Yeah, I would also agree with that. I feel like those two lenses marry up really well, the 35 and 85, in terms of like telling a story. I really enjoy the 85 because of the fact that most of the times when I see things in my head, they are 35, and then if I really want to like accentuate something or pull it out of the story, using an 85 really helps to like focus that in. And I feel like that's something we don't do enough, or at least me personally. I feel like I more often will walk the camera in closer with a 35 than lens up, just because I'm usually in love with the 35. I like that we have it on there, and that kind of goes for the whole gamut of lenses. I feel like me personally, I keep saying we, I don't usually shoot at longer focal lengths, but I like what they do. I like the compression they offer, but they do, for me, they kind of like take you out of the story. So that's the one thing that I don't always enjoy, but sometimes it's important to like stop and pick out a detail and really show it to the viewer, and you have to be really intentional with that. If you're just shooting on like a 70-200 all the time, I feel like it starts to just flatten out all of your images, and it loses that character and that separation that the wider focal lengths like 35 will give you.
Yeah, I agree. I think also just some of the shoots we've been doing recently, they've been relatively fast-paced, and we're shooting intentionally for a shorter or quicker edit, and so we basically have little story beats that we have to hit pretty quickly, and so using a 35 millimeter, either in scenarios like that or kind of run and gun if you don't know what you're getting into, is really safe, and you can quickly move in and out to get the shots you need. But I think if we were to approach something a little bit more cinematic or something with very specific storyboards in a more controlled environment, I feel like that's the scenario that we would most likely be lensing up when the time calls for it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I do think that a lot of what we're doing does kind of call for sticking to one focal length too, just because mostly we're trying to capture like a perspective of how somebody would interact in a space or with a product.
Mm-hmm.
And I think keeping a single focal length kind of helps with that at times. I know we've been using the 90 a lot more lately, and I do like what that does, but like I mentioned earlier, definitely like stands out. So you have to really pick and choose when you're going to lens up, because it is a very obvious difference.
Right. So the next topic or question we're giving each other is, what is your favorite type of camera movement? Mine is, again, slightly twofold, kind of depending on what the exact shot is, but I'm always in love with the orbiting camera. If your subject is static, I feel like with, especially with a longer focal length, it's kind of a trope at this point. Like back in the early days of like filmmaker YouTube, I feel like all the epic shots you'd see is like 100 millimeters on a gimbal with like the background sweeping behind someone. So I think it can be overdone and like easily make a shot overly dramatic, but when used with some level of taste, I think is a really solid way to make something that's not moving on its own feel either more cinematic or heroic or dramatic. And then the other side of that, which I think we've been doing a lot recently with our dog product shoots we've been doing recently, whenever we have somebody walking in front of frame, I love using a wide lens and making the camera do an opposite motion as the motion of the subject. So if your camera is here pointing this way and a subject is walking towards camera, if you move forward and then tilt the camera or pan the camera following the subject as you're moving the opposite direction, it kind of gives the illusion that they're moving a lot faster than they are. So it doesn't take the scene out of realism. Like it still looks right, but something about it feels more intense and more cinematic, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. Like, I love the orbits, and especially like you said, when there's some like counteractive movement, creating that contrast. It's very visually interesting. I would say, now that I heard you give your answer, I kind of realized that mine's pretty obvious to me, and I think it is a very common movement, but it would be like the dolly or truck in or out shot. And to me, in my head, at the beginning of a story or beginning of a video, I tend to like gravitate towards this, because I feel like, again, it goes back to like what I said about the 35 millimeter lens. My objective is typically like, how do I get somebody to feel like they are the camera? And when you're dollying in towards a static subject, or it could be a moving subject, I just feel like it's a good way to really pull you into the story, and you feel like you're focusing in, you're following this story along. And same with the opposite at the end, when the camera tends to pull away. I feel like it's a really nice way to reveal things around the subject and sort of come to terms with the film or the video.
Yeah, and I think kind of touched on this, but with putting the viewer in the space of the video, I feel like it's a sort of subconscious thing where, like, if the video is an experience, you start by walking into it, and it's like kind of simulates that perspective change where if you're walking towards whatever you're supposed to be looking at, you're getting closer, and it's the same kind of movement as the camera. And then same thing with when the video is coming to a close, you're like, oh, it's going away. I guess it's over now. Like, it's kind of I think it just relates to like how our everyday perspective translates to video. Yeah,
for sure. I just also really like the excitement it can build, like in the beginning of a video. I feel like you almost feel like you're running into the film and you can't look away.
Right.
So there's a couple different ways to do a trucking in shot or dolly in shot. The quick and easy way is we'll set our camera up on a gimbal and walk obviously straight towards their subject. And then the longer form way, the more commonly seen way, I guess, would be like on a dolly, using a dolly track or a slider, depending on how much movement you're going to need. Typically with this sort of camera movement, I found it works best when you have a lot of it, and you use a wider focal length, because it creates a lot of drama as you're getting closer to your subject. The background starts to fall off, the background stays further away, and your subject gets closer, creating that sort of distortion.
To achieve my favorite camera movements in an orbit or putting the camera in opposite motion to the subject, again, I think using a gimbal is probably how we most often do that, because you're able to carefully control the amount and the rate of the pan that the camera is doing. Aside from that, I think I've been able to get similar shots handheld, especially with the opposite movement kind of thing. If you're just holding the camera and sort of leaning back and someone's coming towards you, if you push forward and pan at the same time, that can achieve that look. With an orbit, it's a little bit more tough to do it handheld, because usually that involves walking and focusing on exactly where the camera's pointed. So I would say a gimbal is definitely my preferred tool to achieve that kind of shot. So now we're going to talk about our favorite lighting patterns. For me, it's pretty straightforward. I feel like you can't go wrong with 3-point lighting, but more specifically for a static subject, like for an interview, for example, I'm a really big fan of, I think, what we do most often for interviews, which is get a soft key light and form a Rembrandt lighting shape on the subject's face, but specifically have the camera opposite the light so that you get a nice fall off on the side-facing camera, and so you can see the subject's illuminated face on the opposite side and then see the shadows on the front-facing side. Obviously, there's other lights you can add to this kind of setup to improve it. Depending on your scenario, if you're in a really dark area, it might be nice to get a front-facing fill, or also get a hair light. But for me, I guess the first thing I notice when I'm looking at an interview setup is how light falls on the subject's face. So that's usually my go-to interview or static camera or static subject setup.
Yeah, I'd have to say something similar. It's typically around like a Rembrandt lighting pattern, but it sometimes goes as far as like a split light, depending on the tools we have with us. I would typically lean towards it being a little bit more on the split side, because when you are able to get the light further behind the subject and then return some of that light back onto the subject with either like a fill card or a secondary light, I tend to like that sort of contrast better, depending on obviously the scene. But yeah, I would say I agree with what you said about keeping the light on the far side of the subject and having some sort of contrast. Obviously, we like to keep it as natural as possible when you're lighting a subject, just so it's not super punchy.
Rembrandt lighting or split lighting can be good for keeping the scene realistic and looking kind of natural. But to kind of go off that, my second answer for this is a technique I've used in a couple music videos I've made that I really like, where I feel like in something like that, you don't necessarily have to keep it as realistic or natural looking. But one of my other favorite lighting setups is a filled silhouette. So basically you light the background pretty high key, whether it's with color or just white. I really like creating a really strong silhouette of the subject and then using a little bit of fill in the front near the camera so that you can still see some definition in the subject's face, but the first striking image you see when you look at the frame is the silhouette of their face.
Nice, yeah, and you get some of that nice light wrapping around and helping to illuminate their face as well.
Yeah, depending on the setup, that can happen from lighting the background. If you're just a few feet away from it, you'll usually get some bounce, or you can add in some edge lights, which I think that setup leaves a lot of room for creativity, especially, like I said, making a music video. You can change the colors of those lights. The one that I did in our old studio, I did that setup where I had blue and green on the background and then white light wrapping around them, and then a soft fill from the front. So it kind of just creates a striking image that doesn't look natural, but in a more creative use case like that, I think it can be really strong.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's similar to what we're working with right now. We have a lot of light coming from behind.
Right.
But if I were to pick a second lighting pattern that was maybe a little bit more on the creative side, like you came up with, I would probably go with like a top-down light with some sort of dome or something that's really controlled, because I really like the look you can create when you're basically just isolating one pool of light. We'll typically do it with like a softbox that's parabolic with like a grid, mostly for products, but it can help. This technique can help if you're adding it to a lighting setup for a subject, for like a person. So I feel like a lot of the time, you know, if you can't place lights left and right, maybe you already have your key source off to the left, but you're not getting the kind of return or fill you want. Putting a light top down just past the subject, or just on the key side of the subject, will help carry some of that light over and fill in the shadow side of the face.
Yeah, definitely, because if you were to do that setup without any other lights, that's kind of your typical interrogation setup where you have just like one hard bulb, or even if with a soft light, if you have the bulb or the light source right above someone, you get sharp shadows, sometimes a little bit of a highlight on the nose or eyebrows.
For sure.
But it's a very intense, dramatic looking lighting setup without the help of other fill and other lights.
Yeah, that's why I was going for more of my creative take, I would say, for like products. If I really want to make a dramatic video, or like, you know, maybe it's like a workout video or something like that, I think that sort of lighting's kind of called for to help create all this highlights and shadows and definition.
So our next topic is going to be our favorite lighting techniques. So this is how we achieve either some of the favorite lighting patterns that we discussed earlier, or just tools and strategies we use on set to dial in our lighting. For me, my favorite lighting technique, I think, is very simple but very effective for a lot of different scenarios, and that is to use a large soft source as your key, and then put just a bounce card or place your subject next to a white wall on the opposite side. And the reason I really like this is because you're not using another light that you have to dial in the intensity of. I find you usually get a very natural looking fill light on the opposite side of someone's face when you're using a white or bright surface. I think that's because in real life, in everyday life, there's plenty of areas or spots where that's just the scenario. If you're in a small room where you're next to a window, that window is going to be your key light, and then if there's a white wall 5 feet to your side, that's going to be your bounce. So I feel like it's a very simple yet effective way to make a subject look nice, look good, while also making it look very natural and not overproduced.
I'm going to go with probably the more obvious answer for me, just speaking from a lot of the work we do. We're oftentimes shooting on location where maybe we don't have a lot of control over the house lights, and we don't have time to like take lights out, you know, like actual lighting fixtures, or like put ND over lighting fixtures. So sometimes we have to find more creative ways to still create a pleasing image. So my two favorite lighting techniques would be, one, finding places to bounce light. I feel like oftentimes when you're trying to light a subject, you think about just pointing, you know, how am I going to point this light at this person? But oftentimes your best solution could be just using a white wall or something in your vicinity to provide light back to the subject, and that way it's not as obvious that you're bringing lights into these environments. Like I said, I'm speaking from our experience going into people's businesses and like creating an interview environment that still represents their business, but is maybe just a more pleasing option. And my other technique would be, again, with working with practical lights, kind of metering for the available light and figuring out where you want that to lie. So most of the time we'll often try to underexpose a lot of the house lights so that they're not as prevalent and not having as much of an effect on the subject, because they're often horrible color temperatures or just weird lighting fixtures. And if you could use those to your advantage, like sometimes we'll frame, if there's like rows of LED lights, using those as more of like a framing element by blocking them out with either ND or internal ND, whatever it might be, and then using your key light to either beat it out a little bit or provide a little bit more light than what's available to you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we do pretty commonly on our shoots, especially in indoor environments where there's a lot of practical lights. And we were also just talking about this the other day, how I think one of the simplest things you can do, or one of the simplest things that bringing in video lighting achieves, is it allows you to lower the exposure on the available light. And so I think, in my opinion, one of the most useful cases of this is when you have practical lights in your scene, whether or not they're the correct color temperature for your scene. If you can bring the exposure of those down, it becomes a much more pleasing image, so that you don't have hot spots, you don't have blown out light fixtures in the background. So just bringing in a light that's stronger than those allows you to lower your exposure, and that way it makes the lights in the background not distracting or overexposed.
Yeah, and I want to hit on a note you mentioned earlier about key lights. I do agree that like having as big of a source as possible is generally the best option depending on the scene. But one thing I feel like often gets overlooked when we're looking at a scene is the fact that you could always, well, typically with an interview, depending on your framing, you could just walk the light in a little bit instead of like getting a bigger source, and that will in turn make the light source bigger. So that's something that we try to do as much as possible. We're often working in pretty small environments, so it usually ends up happening anyways. But the closer you have your light to the subject, the lower you can turn the power down and still get a lot out of that light, and it will create a more soft and flattering light, I guess. It tends to wrap a lot nicer and fill in a lot of those areas instead of when you pull that same exact light source back, it gets pretty hard pretty fast.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you're using a 3-foot softbox versus a 6-foot softbox, those could end up having the same result depending on the distance from the subject.
Yep, if you're just lighting one subject and not like a whole scene.
Right.
So my favorite lighting environments would have to be the first and most important. If there's like any windows available, I'm like, all right, we're good. We can work with this. Having windows, you can either stick a light out there and if it's a gray day, or like some diffusion and just kind of like sell this idea that light's coming from somewhere, because it allows you to get your light. You can still shoot into a corner and you can get light from behind, which is amazing. You have great framing elements and great lighting. That's pretty much all you need. The other one would probably be no windows and some nice practicals, because then you can use the practicals as like framing elements. I'm thinking of like a gym, when there's like fluorescence. There's no other pools of light coming in that are going to affect the scene and create distractions. Just these lights that you're able to hopefully control with ND and beat them out, and then use your light as power.
Well, you stole my answer.
Okay.
Almost exactly. I was going to say, depending on the shoot, if it's something more realistic, I guess in my mind, the two scenarios I'm comparing my answers for these questions to is like, am I shooting something very artistic and creative, like a music video, or am I shooting something for a client, like an interview or a brand story or something like that? So for something more creative, kind of going back to my days in photo school, I always wanted the black studio. I wanted no light. I wanted to be in control of every little bit of light in that room. So if I'm doing something creative with lighting that doesn't have to look super natural or realistic, I'd opt to have no windows, no bright spaces, just a fully black box. But for interviews or a lot of client work we do, I'd agree that a bright room with a lot of windows is usually the best, because for the same reasons you said, it gives you options for framing and allows you to accentuate those windows as key lights by placing a softbox next to them or something. So it makes the lighting look a lot more realistic.
Yeah. And I mean, either way, like, obviously there's so many different solutions to any of these scenarios, but I think what we're getting at is like, in terms of just working in like a small crew, oftentimes we are trying to do not the least amount of work, but save a lot of time and money for the client. So if we don't need somebody there to set up 100 negative fills or like ND 10 lights, then we're going to be way better off and be more successful.
That's right.
Joel, what's your favorite lighting tool?
My favorite lighting tool would probably be the grid that we use for softboxes. That was something that early on in my filmmaking career, I never really thought about much. Back in photo school, I used grids for photo lights, but I never really used large softboxes with grids on them for video. And so I think the first time I used that, it kind of blew my mind, and that I was like, wow, I get this really beautiful quality of light, but it is so isolated to the place that I want it to be. So sometimes just walking in a giant soft source can be a great solution, because the ambient light from that fills up the rest of the room. You get a little bit of fall off on the background and fill all around your subject's face. But when you need to dial in something a little bit more specific, I feel like that tool really comes in handy to make the light only go where you want it to go.
Yeah, I absolutely love gridded softboxes. Exactly. For all the reasons you said, it just focuses the light in so much nicer, and you can really isolate your subject and get the quality of light you're looking for. I would say I have two answers for this one. My first one would be favorite lighting tool would probably be, as of lately, tube lights. I feel like they're super underrated, and people just use them typically as like, oh, I want a practical in the scene. I want it to look like the right color temperature. Stick a tube light there. And like, they do look great in frame. I'm a big fan of a tube light in frame. But the fact that they're so small and powerful, you can get them so close to your subject. They're very easy to modify. It just creates like a world of options for any different environment. So those are one thing that basically never stay in the studio. We're always bringing them on location, especially the 2-foot tube lights. Just the ability to quickly have a walk-in light for whether it's a product or a subject where maybe we really like the lighting setup we have and we like the environment. We just want to walk the camera in, get a little bit of extra light so that the subject stands out a little bit more. Tube light can just sit literally right off camera. You could bounce it, you could throw diffusion over it and get any result you want out of it. The one thing you do have to watch out with tube lights and grids are reflections and catch lights. You can get weird reflections and catch lights from both those. Sometimes it's a desired thing, but yeah, we've used tube lights in so many different situations. It's unreal.
Yeah, and you quickly mentioned this, but I think maybe the biggest benefit of tube lights, I think, is just their size. Like comparing the use that we get out of our Forzas, like our big mono lights that have a ballast and plug into the wall and need to be on a C-stand and everything, comparing the size and form factor of bringing one of those to the shoot versus a long skinny bag that has 4 fully charged tube lights that are battery powered, I feel like it just really, really helps with being able to think on our feet, and if we have to quickly make an adjustment, we can just grab a light out of the bag and know that we have a few more if we need them. I think it just is one of the most versatile lights that we have that we can bring on set.
Absolutely, for many different reasons. You add pops of color in the background, you can put them in the frame and they look cool. But I said I had 2. The other one was a light meter, just because I'm obsessed with light meters and like metering. I just feel like it makes my job so much easier and I actually can understand what's going on, which is funny because similar to you with grids in college, I don't think I touched a light meter. I was like, yeah, I don't need that.
I have the opposite story in that my professors forced us to use light meters in studios and in all of our classes, and it was like, I am wasting my time. And then I graduated and never used one. And then since working with you, I've kind of been reminded of how useful they can be.
Yeah, especially when we go on location and you're like, you don't really think about the possibilities until you actually know the numbers and like what you could do with it, like metering for practical lights and stuff like that, and figuring out what you can do to get the best result out of them.
Yeah, because your eyes are good, but not as good as a light meter. Like you can look at the highlights and shadows in a scene and think, all right, the light that we brought will probably fill that in. But with a light meter, you can know that exactly.
Yeah, or you could think, oh, that's not going to affect my subject, and you meter for it, and it's like almost the same as your key light. Gotta do something about that.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks for checking out this video. I know this was a little different of a format, but we're interested in doing more videos like this that are a little bit more conversational between either Joel or I or other individuals that might have input on subjects like this. So please leave us a comment if you like it and let us know, if you want to see more of this.
And we'd also love to hear from you if you have other opinions that were different than ours, or if you agreed with a lot of the stuff we said, let us know in the comments. I know every filmmaker has different perspective and different experience, so we always love hearing what people's experience has led them to prefer on set.
Yeah, it was interesting at the beginning there. I thought all of our answers were going to be the same after like the first 2.
Yeah.
I'm happy we found some differences.
I thought about that. It was like, we shoot together all the time. I'm not going to pick the first thing that comes to mind. I'm going to think a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I thought about it for a while too.
Gotcha. All right, well, if you enjoyed the video, leave us a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.